On the 18th of January 2025, the United States Department of Justice released what it described as the final major production of documents tied to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. The release arrived not as a single manageable file, but as an avalanche. Approximately 3 million pages of federal documentation, emails, correspondence, financial records, travel logs, and personal communications dumped into the public domain with a comprehensiveness that no palace communications team, no matter how experienced or well-resourced, had been adequately prepared to manage. For weeks, researchers, journalists, and investigators worked through the material with the particular intensity of people who understood that what was buried inside those millions of pages had the potential to reshape reputations, reopen questions, and permanently destabilize narratives that powerful institutions had spent years and considerable resources constructing. And buried inside those pages, appearing not once, not incidentally, not in passing, but by name hundreds of times, were two women the British palace had spent the better part of a decade carefully positioning as collateral innocents. Princess Beatrice, Princess Eugenie. The documents did not care about the palace's positioning. Before we begin today's royal update, I want to take a quick moment. Many of you enjoy these videos but haven't subscribed yet, and you definitely don't want to miss the latest developments and fascinating stories from the world of royalty. Subscribing is completely free and helps you stay up to date as every new royal moment unfolds. And while you're here, let us know, where are you watching from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see viewers joining us from all around the world. The public reaction, when the scale of the sisters' presence in the files became clear, was not the clean outrage of a simple scandal. It was something more complicated and considerably more difficult to contain. It was the particular unease of people who had accepted a version of events that the documented evidence was now quietly but systematically refusing to support. The managed narrative, constructed with considerable skill over years of careful press management and strategic public sympathy, had always rested on a foundation that required the audience to accept certain things without examining them too closely. That Beatrice and Eugenie were essentially peripheral to their father's world, that they had been brought into proximity with dangerous figures through no agency of their own, that they were daughters first, adults second, and that the distinction absolved them of the questions their documented presence in those files was now making impossible to avoid. Andrew Looney was not willing to allow that foundation to stand unchallenged, and his credentials for challenging it were not those of a man making casual accusations. Looney spent 4 years producing what the Daily Mail called the most devastating royal biography ever written. Traitor King, his forensic examination of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, drew on more than 300 interviews, court papers, and freedom of information disclosures that most journalists had neither the patience nor the institutional access to pursue. The Sunday Times noted that it made Prince Harry's memoir look restrained by comparison. These are not descriptions applied to tabloid speculation. They are descriptions applied to 4 years of documented, sourced, legally scrutinized research by a man who understands the difference between allegation and evidence and has built his professional reputation on that distinction. When a biographer of that caliber looks at the Epstein files, looks at the documented presence of 2 adult princesses across hundreds of references in federal documents, and says publicly that the narrative of innocence is being deliberately manufactured, that statement carries a weight that the palace's silence cannot simply absorb. What Looney said, stated plainly and without the hedging that characterizes most commentary on the royal family, was this: Beatrice and Eugenie are not innocent bystanders caught in their parents' wreckage. They are, in his assessment based on 4 years of research, deeply involved. He said the campaign to portray them as casualties rather than participants is deliberate. He said the palace is actively managing a version of events that the documented evidence does not support. He said they were not 5-year-old girls when they entered Epstein's orbit. They were adults, and he said that if they continue trading on their royal titles while the questions about their involvement remain unanswered, they will become an increasingly serious problem not just for their own reputations, but for the king himself. Those are not ambiguous words. That is not the careful, qualified language of someone managing legal exposure. That is a direct accusation from a credentialed researcher who has spent 4 years inside this family's documented history and arrived at conclusions the palace finds deeply inconvenient. To understand why those conclusions carry the force they do, one must first understand the single documented fact that sits at the absolute center of this story, and from which no amount of palace management has been able to create meaningful distance. 5 days after Jeffrey Epstein walked out of a Florida prison where he had served time for soliciting prostitution from a minor, a lunch was arranged. The DOJ documents contain the email exchange that confirms it. Epstein messaged Sarah Ferguson asking her whereabouts. Ferguson replied that she was in Miami and heading to meet him. When Epstein offered to send a car, Ferguson declined but asked for the address. And then she wrote the 7 words that have since become the most scrutinized sentence in this entire affair. It will be myself, Beatrice, and Eugenie. Beatrice was 20 years old. Eugenie was 19. Epstein's conviction was not a secret. It was public record, reported, documented, and available to anyone who looked. And on that afternoon, 5 days after a convicted sex offender completed his sentence for crimes against a young woman, 2 adult princesses sat down to lunch with him. That is not allegation. That is not Looney's interpretation. That is what the documents say, and it is where the questions that the palace cannot answer begin. There is a particular kind of evidence that resists narrative management, not because it is explosive in the conventional sense, but because it is mundane, because it exists in the flat, unadorned language of emails and records and documented exchanges between people who never imagined those exchanges would one day be read by 3 million strangers. The Epstein files are full of that kind of evidence, and the sections that concern Beatrice and Eugenie are not dramatic. They are not cinematic. They are simply there, page after page, reference after reference, in the colorless bureaucratic language of federal documentation that carries precisely because of its absence of theater. You cannot accuse a document of exaggerating. You cannot dismiss an email as motivated by agenda. The words are what they are. And what they are, in this case, is deeply uncomfortable for 2 women whose entire public positioning has depended on the world, accepting that their connection to Jeffrey Epstein was distant, passive, and entirely beyond their control. Begin with the emails surrounding the Palm Beach lunch because they do not exist in isolation. The exchange that confirmed Ferguson's arrangement of that meeting 5 days after Epstein's prison release was not a single anomalous communication between 2 people who had otherwise severed contact. It was part of a sustained correspondence that the DOJ documents reveal with uncomfortable thoroughness. Ferguson was not writing to Epstein as someone managing an awkward legacy connection from a careful distance. She was writing to him with the ease and familiarity of an ongoing relationship. She discussed business propositions. She expressed personal affection in terms that sources who have reviewed the documents describe as cringe-inducing in their intimacy. In one exchange, she wrote words that have since been widely reported, telling Epstein she was at his service and asking him to marry her. And woven through that correspondence, repeatedly and without apparent hesitation, were references to her daughters, their whereabouts, their schedules, their personal lives. In one documented exchange, Epstein asked about a redacted visitor coming to London and whether there might be any chance of Ferguson saying hello. Ferguson's response confirmed that Beatrice was in London with her father. A convicted sex offender was asking about a princess's location and schedule. Her mother was providing that information. That is what the documents say. Then there are the Christmas cards. In his BBC Newsnight interview, the interview that became a masterclass in self-destruction broadcast to the nation in November 2019, Andrew told Emily Maitlis that he had no contact with Epstein after their photographed meeting in Central Park in 2010. The DOJ documents contain Christmas cards, sent by Andrew to Epstein across multiple years following, that claimed severance, each one containing photographs of Beatrice and Eugenie. The implications of those cards operate on 2 levels simultaneously. The first is the most obvious. They directly contradict Andrew's sworn public statement about the timeline of his contact with Epstein. The second is less discussed, but no less significant. Year after year, The images of two princesses were being sent to a convicted sex offender by their father as a gesture of continued personal warmth and connection. Whether Beatrice and Eugenie knew their photographs were being used this way is a question the documents do not answer. But it is a question that their continued silence makes increasingly difficult to bracket as irrelevant. What fundamentally complicates the innocence argument, what moves this conversation from the realm of parental judgment into the territory of personal accountability, is a single documented fact about Beatrice specifically that has received considerably less attention than the Palm Beach lunch, but carries in some ways more analytical weight. Beatrice was present during the preparation of her father's BBC Newsnight interview. She was not a passive observer in an adjacent room. She was advising him. She was part of the conversation about how Andrew should frame his relationship with Epstein to the nation. She was, by multiple accounts, involved in negotiating the terms and approach of a national television appearance whose entire subject was her father's association with a convicted sex offender. That requires a level of sophistication about the Epstein situation that is simply incompatible with the portrait of naive innocence the palace has worked to maintain. You cannot simultaneously be sophisticated enough to advise your father on the strategic management of an Epstein scandal and innocent enough not to understand the depth and nature of that scandal. Those two positions cannot occupy the same person at the same time. Looney's point is not subtle, and it does not need to be. The documented evidence does not describe peripheral figures brushing accidentally against their parents' world. It describes two adult women whose names appear hundreds of times across millions of pages of federal documentation, whose mother discussed their personal lives directly with a convicted sex offender, whose father sent their photographs to that same man for years while publicly claiming to have cut contact, and one of whom was actively involved in managing her father's public response to the very scandal now consuming them. The facts are not allegations. The facts are the documents. And the documents are not going away. There is a difference between a narrative that emerges organically from public sympathy and a narrative that is constructed, maintained, and actively defended by institutional machinery with a specific outcome in mind. The first is a natural consequence of human compassion extended toward two women in an impossible position. The second is something considerably more calculated. Andrew Looney's most explosive claim is not about the Palm Beach lunch or the Christmas cards or the hundreds of references scattered across the DOJ files. His most explosive claim is about what has happened since those facts became known. He is alleging that the portrayal of Beatrice and Eugenie as innocent bystanders is not a spontaneous public perception, but a deliberately manufactured and actively coordinated campaign. That the palace, the media apparatus surrounding it, and possibly the sisters themselves have been working in concert to ensure that the documented evidence never fully penetrates the protective layer of managed sympathy that has been built around them. That is not a small allegation. That is an accusation of institutional deception at the highest level. The palace's strategy, when examined with the detachment that distance allows, has the internal logic of an institution making the best available calculation under impossible circumstances. King Charles is genuinely fond of his nieces. He does not wish to be seen punishing two women for sins that were, at their origin, their fathers. But he also cannot afford to be seen actively protecting figures whose documented entanglement with Epstein remains the subject of ongoing federal scrutiny and growing public pressure. So the institution has chosen the path it has chosen in moments of intractable difficulty before. The middle path. Beatrice and Eugenie remain within the private family structure. They are excluded from major public engagements, notably absent from events like Royal Ascot, where their presence would generate the kind of scrutiny the palace is managing to avoid. They are neither defended publicly nor abandoned entirely. They are simply allowed to recede, quietly and without announcement, into a background the institution hopes will eventually become permanent. The strategy is not without precedent. It is, in fact, the same strategy the palace deployed with Andrew himself in the years before his situation became impossible to contain through managed distance alone. The question Looney is asking is whether it will work a second time. His answer is unambiguous. It will not. The financial dimension Looney raises is the thread that has received the least public attention and carries potentially the most serious implications. His reference to the Selman Turk case and money in the sisters, accounts that could not be explained, has not been elaborated upon in granular detail in his public statements. No specific amounts have been cited. No formal documentation has been produced in the public domain. But the allegation exists, and its implications are significant precisely because of what they would mean if substantiated. There is a categorical difference between two women who were naive and insufficiently curious about their parents' associations and two women who received unexplained financial benefit from the network those associations built. The first is a failure of judgment. The second is a form of material participation. Looney is not claiming the second has been proven. He is claiming it has not been investigated with anything approaching the rigor the documented evidence demands. And he is claiming that the absence of that investigation is itself part of the campaign he is describing. What makes Looney's deliberate campaign allegation most difficult to dismiss is the behavior it is being used to explain. The sisters have been offered major platforms to tell their story. Oprah Winfrey, Netflix, outlets that would guarantee them the kind of sympathetic, controlled environment in which a genuine innocence narrative could be delivered with maximum impact and minimum risk. They have declined everyone. Their public silence in the face of accumulating documented evidence is not the silence of women who have nothing to say. It is, Looney argues, the silence of women who have made a precise calculation about what speaking would cost them. And at the center of that calculation sit two letters that explain everything about why the silence continues. HRH, the titles are not ceremonial abstractions. They are professional infrastructure. They open doors that close permanently without them. They create access that cannot be replicated through any other means available to two women whose entire adult lives have been built around the connections and opportunities that royal status provides. Looney's assessment of their priorities is delivered without softening. They will throw their parents under the bus to keep those titles. The loyalty, he is saying, runs precisely as deep as the cost of maintaining it, not a single inch deeper. And the palace, which understands this calculation better than anyone, is counting on it to hold long enough for the questions to exhaust themselves. Whether it will is the only question that matters now. There is a moment in every managed narrative when the management itself becomes the story, when the effort required to maintain a carefully constructed version of events grows so visible, so strenuous, so architecturally dependent on the public's continued willingness not to ask certain questions, that the scaffolding holding the narrative upright becomes more conspicuous than the narrative it was built to protect. Beatrice and Eugenie have not yet reached that moment publicly. But the distance between where they are and where that moment waits is shrinking with every wave of documentation, every unanswered question, every declined interview, and every public engagement where their absence speaks with the particular eloquence of things deliberately left unsaid. Andrew Looney believes that moment is coming. The documents suggest he is right. The title question is where the entire argument ultimately lands because it is the most concrete and the most revealing. Looney has been explicit about what he believes the sisters should do: voluntarily renounce their HOH titles, except that the documented evidence of their family's entanglement with Epstein demands a gesture of public accountability that silence and managed distance cannot substitute for. He frames it not as punishment, but as integrity. An act of renewal that would signal something the palace's careful positioning has conspicuously failed to signal: that accountability matters more than access, that transparency is worth more than the doors a title opens. The sisters have not done it. There is no credible indication they intend to. And the reason, Looney argues with the bluntness of someone who has spent 4 years studying this family's decision-making architecture, is straightforward. The titles are not incidental to their lives. They are foundational. Remove them, and what remains is two women without the institutional infrastructure that has defined every professional opportunity, every significant connection, every door opened in their adult lives. That is not a sacrifice most people make voluntarily. And Beatrice and Eugenie, whatever else the documents suggest about their judgment, are not people who make unnecessary sacrifices. The four possible futures that now face them are not equally likely, and the asymmetry between them tells its own story. The first is continued silence. The palace's strategy holds. The questions gradually exhaust the public's attention. The sisters fade into private life, retain their titles, and the managed narrative of peripheral innocence survives by default rather than by vindication. This remains the outcome the institution is engineering toward. The second is escalating documentation. More material emerges from the Epstein files. The financial thread Looney references is pulled by investigators with the authority and the resources to pull it properly. The unexplained payments are explained in terms that the innocence narrative cannot survive. The palace is forced to act not because it chooses accountability, but because the alternative becomes institutionally untenable. The third is voluntary disclosure. One or both sisters decide that controlled truth is preferable to uncontrolled revelation. They accept one of the major interview offers that have been extended and declined. They tell their version. The risk of this path is considerable because the version they tell must be reconcilable with the documents, and the documents are not a foundation on which a simple innocence narrative can be cleanly constructed. The fourth is legal compulsion. Developments in the ongoing investigations surrounding Andrew pull the sisters into formal scrutiny. They are not suspects, but they are witnesses. And witnesses, in federal investigations of this scale and seriousness, do not always get to choose their moment or their platform. What unites all four possibilities is the thing that makes Looney's intervention genuinely significant beyond the immediate controversy it has generated. He has made it structurally impossible for the palace to continue selling the public a version of events that the documented evidence does not support. Not because he has proven guilt, not because charges have been filed or verdicts delivered. Because he has named the campaign he is alleging with enough specificity and enough credentialed authority that the naming itself changes the terms of the conversation. You cannot unknow that someone with 4 years of documented research is alleging deliberate coordination to manufacture innocence. You cannot unread the emails. You cannot unsee the Christmas cards. You cannot uncount the hundreds of references in the federal files. The documents exist. The lunch happened. The photographs were sent. And two adult women whose names are woven through millions of pages of federal documentation continue to use royal titles that open professional doors while maintaining a silence that closes every avenue of public accountability. The palace is hopping the questions die. Looney is ensuring they do not. And the careful innocence of Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, constructed over years with considerable institutional skill, is becoming something that no amount of managed distance can fully restore. The story, as one observer noted with the quiet precision of someone who has watched this family for a very long time, is only just beginning to be told.